Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. This one was recommended by a friend. Sort of. It turns out the anime he was actually talking about was Heaven's design team. I stumbled across Heaven's memo pad shortly after our conversation, and the titles were similar enough that I figured this had to be the show he was talking about. I started reading the summary, and I love mysteries and detective stories, so I was sold before I had a chance to realize this was the wrong show. But we're here now, and you actually don't have to worry about spoilers with this one. It does have a mystery element to it, but not in the sense that the series revolves around one big, all-encompassing mystery. Those questions are more to do with their individual cases, which I don't really feel the need to get into the details of. Looking back at the end of the series, my thoughts and opinions have more to do with the anime as a whole, rather than any particular mystery that stole the show. Heaven's memo pad opens with our main protagonist, Narumi, moving to Tokyo, but this isn't much of an event for Narumi. This is just the latest move in a lifetime of periodically relocating for his father's job. But while exploring the city on his first day, he happens across a girl jumping from the window of a shady hotel. A very brief interaction with a group of amateur detectives follows, but they're quick to send him on his way so they can question the man she was running from. So Narumi tries to brush it off and go about his life as normal. He starts school and does his best to keep to himself. His history of moving from town to town has taught him not to get attached. Narumi's loner tactics work until he's cornered on the roof by Ayaka, his much bubblier classmate who's determined to be his friend. She wears him down, eventually bringing him along to the ramen shop where she works, which also happens to be the headquarters for the group of somewhat shady detectives he encountered on his first day. He's sent up to the top of a nearby apartment building to meet Alice, a mysterious young girl who spends most of her time surrounded by computer screens. She runs this operation they've got going on here, and she explains to Narumi that they're NEAT detectives. NEAT is an acronym for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. When I've seen NEATs portrayed in anime in the past, it's usually in the super socially awkward, total recluse sort of way. And Alice sort of leans toward that variety. She's the real techie one, doing all the hacking and computer-based research, and she is socially immature, but she is also very young. Alice's circumstances are a little complicated, and we'll come back to her. The other three, Hiro, Tetsu, and Major, are all adults who've dropped out of high school or college, but they've all got their own social connections and outside friends, and a lot of the work they do is more traditional detective work. The general NEAT aspect of the story is another thing I plan to touch on later, but I appreciated from the start that this setup was a little different. Narumi is soon welcomed into the group, and sworn into the gang they've partnered with, and gets sucked into the world of underground mysteries. I always find it harder to describe shows that are made up of a bunch of mini plot lines like this one. No single case they worked on really defined the series for me. They all came together to make up the whole. The real connecting point is Narumi and his character growth throughout, which does make sense. He is the main protagonist, but you would be hard-pressed to find a blander-looking protagonist than Narumi, which is maybe why it surprised me how much personality he ended up having. He's really moved by each of their cases, and you can see him trying to better himself from what he learns. He goes from doing his best not to get attached to anyone, to having an impressive amount of faith in those human attachments. And pretty soon he's the group's strongest believer of no action being truly unforgivable, no friendship impossible to mend. It just impressed me again and again. because I liked Narumi just fine, but I really didn't expect him to carry the story the way he does. But that is the role your main protagonist should play, so kudos to the writers for that. There are just too many anime out there these days where the main protagonist introduces the story, but then essentially fades into the background afterwards. Heaven's Memo Pad does have a mature rating, which frees it up to cover some pretty dark topics. We start out with sex trafficking and end with a hardcore drug ring. This gave the series an edge to it that I liked, and the individual mysteries were usually pretty interesting too. I couldn't always predict where they were going, which is also a plus. But I think the anime's strongest point was the handling of Narumi's character. On its own, that's not a bad thing. It gets a little disappointing when you look back and realize that Narumi was the only member of our neat detective group who really felt explored. The clients and subjects of their investigations tend to get a lot of focus. It's not that this series couldn't flesh out backstories and motivations. It just felt like their focus was often in the wrong place. By the time the series was over, I was still left with all sorts of questions about Alice. As far as anyone knows, she really is as young as she looks, so how exactly did she come to be living alone, cared for mostly by Ayaka and the ramen shop owner? How does she afford all her fancy equipment? How does she get away with not going to school? None of these questions are ever answered. And I mean, she's extremely intelligent, and it's always possible she has the wealthy but neglectful sort of parents. It's not hard to come up with headcanons that could explain away these things, but she's such a central character to the story that the writers didn't make an effort to explore her makes her feel a little gimmicky, like she exists just to draw in a certain audience. And that bratty but unusually gifted little sister trope has never really been my thing. But also, I just felt bad for Hiro, Tetsu, and Major by the end. They do most of the legwork in these cases, and they don't even get all that much screen time. Alice at least has a solid presence in the story. I think it's entirely possible to get through the whole series without learning the names of the other three. They really deserved better. It's particularly disappointing because the second case revolves around a girl who hired them to find her father, who has a shady past and who's been kidnapped by the Yakuza. It starts up some conversations between Ayaka and Narumi about their own families. Narumi's mother died a while back, so he's living with his older sister, and despite moving all the time to be closer to him, their dad only ever comes home a few days a year. Ayaka's home life kind of fell apart when her parents divorced. It makes it a little clearer why they've been able to devote so much to Alice's cause, and I thought it was going to be the start to what could have been a really sweet found family element to this show. It would have been a great lead-in to exploring the other NEETs, why they chose to drop out and live their lives this way rather than trying to find some more conventional job. But after this train of thought is thrown out there, the series never really picks it back up. In general, the handling of the NEET aspect was a low point for me, because that was their thing, you know? There are plenty of anime about detective groups out there, and Alice is always quick to correct people that they're different because they're NEET detectives, so I expected the series to have something meaningful to say at the end of it all about people who choose to live their lives in unconventional ways. But I didn't really feel it. It wasn't even as big a deal as I expected for Alice to leave the safe haven of her room. It's rare, but it does happen when the case calls for it. So, overall, Heaven's Memo Pad was good, but I didn't feel like it lived up to its own potential. But I do want to say that even if you're not sold on the whole show, I really recommend checking out the first episode. Heaven's Memo Pad is technically only 12 episodes, but the first episode is double the length of the rest. It gives them time to introduce the characters and solve the mystery without anything feeling rushed, and it has its own message to share about perspective. We're introduced to Narumi on the note that he's never around long enough to get the full picture of a town, which contrasts nicely with Alice, who has an eye on everything behind all her screens. But also, it's a missing persons case, and through the investigation they get to know two people who knew and loved the girl, but saw two very different sides to her life. It's dark, but it comes together really nicely, and at 45 minutes long, about the same length as The Garden of Words, it helps to make it feel like it could stand alone as an OVA or something. So even if you don't want to continue with the rest of the series, I strongly recommend seeing the beginning. If nothing else, this anime got off to a really good start. Thank you for watching.